I am Inspector, and I solved mystery. Welcome to my new case.
It was the kind of rain Oxford keeps for itself. Thin, persistent, and curiously deliberate, as though the city had agreed upon it centuries ago. I remember the cobbles glistening like the scales of some weary animal, and the faint smell of damp paper rising from the library steps. Sunday morning, 10:30, and already the bells of St. Giles were arguing with one another about eternity. I had not been to St. Bride's College for several years. A pity, really. Its courtyard still wore that resigned expression peculiar to places accustomed to brilliance and decay in equal measure. I had been invited by Adrian Fawley, the college's director of music, to what he called a modest resurrection of Schubert and Sherry. His words, not mine. He'd always had a fondness for the theatrical. My fondness, as usual, was for the whiskey I'd left unfinished on my desk, but Oxford exerts a gravitational pull even on those of us who pretend to have escaped it. I remember the sound before the sight, the piano's hesitant beginnings, like someone relearning the art of faith. When I entered the hall, the usual academic murmur fell briefly away. Fawley, gaunt but smiling, conducted from a stool as though he'd been resurrected against his better judgment. The pianist was a woman I did not recognize, slender, absorbed, and wholly unself-conscious in that rare, alarming way that reveals an excess of grief. She played with the precision of someone trying to atone for something irreparable. Fawley greeted me afterward with the tired enthusiasm of an old man still rehearsing vitality. He looked pale, as though he had been reading too many farewell letters. Said something about the damp playing hell with his lungs, about retirement, about meaning to travel. There was always meaning too in Fawley's life, plans arranged like unlit candles. Lewis would have said I was sentimental to notice, but I saw it clearly. The way Fawley's eyes lingered on the pianist as she closed the lid, the brief exchange that passed between them, silent, careful, and final. I caught only the echo of her name from someone near the sherry table. Helen Calthorpe, a visiting fellow in literature, researching something to do with fire imagery and Victorian poetry. I thought it an oddly appropriate subject for someone who played Schubert as if she were already burning. The drizzle had thickened by the time we stepped into the quad. Fawley lit a cigarette and gestured toward the chapel roof, muttering about repairs and the bursar's incompetence. I listened with half an ear. My attention had drifted toward a scrap of conversation behind us. Two women walking arm in arm under one umbrella. He left a note. She burned it twice. The phrase struck me with the peculiar clarity of an unfinished clue. I remember turning slightly, pretending to admire the stonework, but they had already gone, their laughter dissolving into the rain. I asked Fawley if he'd heard. He frowned, then smiled faintly, as though amused by a private recollection. Some people make a habit of burning things, he said. The remark stayed with me longer than it should have. When we parted, I promised to attend his next concert, though we both knew I wouldn't. He pressed my hand a little too tightly, as if measuring the distance between now and never. I walked away through the cloisters, their arches sweating with mist, thinking how Oxford had the curious gift of making every farewell seem rehearsed. Back at my flat in North Oxford, I poured the whiskey I'd been saving and opened the crossword. The clue was simple enough. Twice destroyed, yet somehow living still. I wrote Phoenix without thinking. Outside, the rain had settled into its patient rhythm, tapping against the window like an uninvited thought. I remember wondering then, not for the first time, whether resurrection was simply another word for repetition. Later that night, I found myself replaying Helen Calthorpe's face in my mind. Not beautiful, precisely, but sharpened by restraint, the kind of face that doesn't reveal itself except in reflection. I tried to read, failed, and poured another measure. Somewhere beyond the walls, the college bells began again, tolling with that mournful precision that makes time feel like confession. It was only the next morning when Strange rang, gruff apologetic, speaking too quickly, that I realized the remark I had overheard beneath the dripping arches had been less metaphorical than I'd hoped. He said Fawley had been found dead in his rooms. Pills. A note. The police thought it suicide. I thought again of the smell of rain on stone, of Schubert fading into silence, of the woman who had played as though memory itself were a form of punishment. And for reasons I couldn't then articulate, I knew that someone had burned more than paper. It was Strange who told me, with that uneasy mixture of professional brusqueness and personal pity he keeps for such calls. Fawley, found that morning in his college rooms. Pills, whiskey glass, half finished. A note on the desk, unsigned, but unmistakably addressed to no one at all. The coroner, he said, would likely see no reason to detain the matter. Clear case. Despair, guilt, perhaps. He paused before the word perhaps, as though reluctant to open the door too wide. I told him I'd take a look anyway. He didn't argue. He rarely did when it came to Oxford deaths. He knew I carried some quiet jurisdiction there, not of rank, but of understanding. By the time I reached St. Bride's, the rain had turned from drizzle to the sort of thin, disciplined shower that polishes the stone rather than stains it. The porter, a nervous young man who spoke as though every word might be quoted later, led me up the narrow staircase to Fawley's rooms. The air was still, unnaturally so, with that faint medicinal tang that attends all deaths by intention. A book lay open on the desk. The poems of A.E. Housman, spine cracked about Emerfades, page dog-eared at random. Or not random, I thought. The note, a short typewritten paragraph on college letterhead, rested beside it. No signature, no date. The words were tired, formal, stripped of the warmth of handwriting. I'm sorry. There are things that cannot be forgiven. Please see that she understands. No name, no clue, only that single syllable, intimate and infinite. Lewis arrived some minutes later, his expression carrying that mixture of reverence and resentment the young often feel in old colleges. He asked the usual questions. Had I known the deceased well? Did I believe in suicide? I gave him my usual answers, sufficiently non-committal to sound wise. He looked around, frowning at the orderliness of it all. Most suicides, he said, left behind a mess. Something physical to match the emotional disarray. I agreed, but inwardly. There was something too deliberate here, too staged. The whiskey glass placed precisely on a coaster, the books aligned, even the curtains drawn at a symmetrical distance. Fawley had been a conductor to the last. Near the hearth, a faint grey smear of ash caught my eye. Paper burns quickly, but not cleanly. I crouched and traced the outline with my finger. Two distinct layers of charred residue, overlapping slightly, as though something had been burned once, unsatisfactorily, and then again. Twice. The word returned to me with the same precision as before. She burned it twice. Lewis found a small bottle of barbiturates on the bedside table, half empty, prescription label dated 6 months earlier. Genuine enough. No fingerprints besides Fawley's own. The doctor confirmed as much. All neat. All tidy. Too tidy. The dean arrived, smelling faintly of incense and moral certitude. He expressed his condolences in carefully weighed syllables, the sort one uses in sermons rather than conversation. He called Fawley a troubled soul. Then, lowering his voice, he added that the deceased had been entangled, his word, not mine, with a visiting fellow. A matter the college had hoped would quietly resolve itself. I said nothing. Oxford is built on such quiet resolutions. Later, while the college nurse filled out her forms, I wandered to the window. From that height, the quad seemed less a place than a memory. rain pooling in the flagstones, the chapel bells sighing the hour. On the sill lay a scrap of paper no larger than a postage stamp, caught beneath a bookend. I eased it free. A fragment of typed text, torn mid-sentence, not meant to hurt her again. The font matched the suicide note, but the alignment was off by a fraction. I pocketed it. Outside, Lewis was talking to the porter about who'd last seen Fawley alive. The answer was obvious before it was spoken. The previous evening, around dusk, the woman who played Schubert. She had brought him a letter, the porter said, in a small cream envelope. He'd seen her leave, her eyes red. Thought it best not to interfere. As we left the staircase, the rain began again, fine as dust. The porter closed the door behind us, locking it twice. A superstitious gesture, perhaps, or habit. Oxford men love their rituals of finality. I paused on the steps, looking back at the window of Fawley's room. A dull square of yellow light swallowed slowly by the weather. There was a time when I would have accepted it all as tragedy unadorned, but something in that room had been too composed, too rehearsed. Death rarely leaves such symmetry. And so, as Lewis fetched the car, I wrote a single note in my pocketbook, brief, deliberate, and for my eyes alone. Find the letter. Find the woman. Lewis said she was expecting us, which in Oxford always means someone has warned someone else. I found Helen Calthorpe in a small practice room off the chapel, where the smell of polish and cold stone tried to imitate holiness. She sat with her back to us, testing a trill so quiet it sounded like thought rehearsing itself. When she turned, there was the slowness of someone observed too often and forgiven too rarely. I said we would be brief. She said time is obliged to behave in a college, but it never does. You were at the concert, she reminded me, and after a fractional pause that leaned toward accusation, you heard what people like to say. I told her I had heard only Schubert and rain. She placed her hands on the closed lid of the piano, the way some people touch a gravestone. Adrian was kind, she said. Kindness is not a uniform. It is not protection. She looked at me as though I might disagree. We sat. I asked when she had last seen Fawley. Yesterday evening, she said. I brought him a letter. From whom? I asked. That is a generous question, she said. Generosity usually expects change. Did he keep it? I asked. He kept everything. A draft under the door complicated the silence. When I asked whether she had burned anything, she looked at her hands as if consulting their occupations. Some words are too sharp to store, she said. The first burning was clumsy. The second almost persuaded me. Almost persuaded me carried its own syntax of failure. Where? I asked. In his fireplace, she said, because ash is better shared. Not the letter itself, a copy. He had made one long ago. Copies, I said, have interesting habits of truth. She did not smile. It was not truth he collected, she said. It was permission. She spoke then about music, as musicians do when other topics grow dangerous. The slow movement, she said, helps you tell lies slowly. I told her I preferred the honesty of the scherzo. The scherzo, she replied, only tells the truth in riddles. For a few seconds, it was almost pleasant to quarrel about Schubert with a woman who understood why quarrels are preferable to comfort. I asked whether Adrian had seemed despairing. He looked, she said, as though he had moved his furniture to one wall. And the dean? I asked. The dean liked forgiveness so much he kept it in stock. She misquoted Haussmann while describing remorse, and I corrected her. The slip pricked her composure. The misquotation was habitual. Either she had learned the line from someone careless, or she wished to belong to a memory that never learned her. Lewis, stalwart in his patience, asked the question that wanted asking. Did she love him? Love is a noun people use when verbs become dangerous, she said. Did danger include the envelope the porter saw? Cream paper is not a crime. I noticed a crescent of soot at her cuff near the button. Not damning, but it certified the admission. I also noticed the faintest scent of something not quite domestic, as if polish had been asked to imitate lavender. Did the letter contain an apology? It contained a direction toward the past. On our way out, I paused by the notice board. Among the detritus of reputable culture was a flyer for an amateur recital. The program listed Schubert and a puzzle at the bottom. Burn twice and rise with borrowed feathers. Phoenix, Lewis said. I wrote it down anyway. Outside, the rain had resumed its ordinary labor. Helen stood in the doorway, neither dismissing us nor inviting us back. Be careful with your kindness, she said. I told her I would try stinginess instead. Stinginess also expects change. We walked the wet cloister in a silence that complained of insufficient evidence. Lewis asked whether I believed her. Belief, I said, behaves badly in colleges. What I trusted was the way she watched the door while she spoke, as though expecting the past to enter punctually. That, I thought, was a timetable we could test. There are few silences as articulate as those of a college library after dusk. The air carries a faint suggestion of candle grease and forgotten scholarship, and something else, too, that the years refuse to name. I went there not to read, but to remember how thought feels when it dresses as dust. Lewis had gone to question the porter again. I preferred solitude. The librarian, a stooped woman whose eyes held the weary dignity of someone who has never misplaced a single reference card, granted me a key and a caution about the cold. Her kindness was the sort that expires once the latch clicks. Fawley's desk remained in its usual corner beneath the gallery, half hidden by the long shelf of theology that no one read except the devout and the guilty. His belongings had already been tidied by unseen hands. A small mercy, though it robbed the scene of disorder, and disorder is where truth often hides. Among the remnants lay the volume I had come to see, the poems of A.E. Housman, plain binding, the spine cracked from affection. I opened it not with the reverence of a reader, but with the caution of a man searching an old wound. The poem that caught my eye was marked by an interleaved slip, yellowed and soft as skin. Beneath the lines of "To an Athlete Dying Young," a faint pencil underlining, and round that early laureled head will flock to gaze the strengthless dead. It was the sort of sentiment Fawley might have chosen to admire publicly and despise privately. But it wasn't the underlining that held me. In the outer margin, written in a woman's hand, were 5 words. Twice burned and still remembered. The phrase struck me with a peculiar inevitability, the way a half-forgotten melody might return at the moment one ceases to hum. The handwriting was delicate, deliberate, and newly pressed. Ink that hadn't yet surrendered its gloss. I traced the letters with my thumb and felt that faint tremor one experiences on touching something intimate that doesn't belong to you. Helen's hand, I thought, or her mother's. The librarian, returning with a candle to remind me the hour was late, saw the book open and paused. Her eyes flicked to the inscription, then to me. It wasn't written there before, she said. She had catalogued that copy herself 20 years ago. She smiled, or something like it. There were rumors once, you know, about him and the woman. She paused, watching the flame sway. But that was long before your time, Inspector. I asked her if she remembered the woman's name. She frowned as if the act of recollection required an apology. Mrs. Parmenter, she said at last. Wife of the dean. Tragic business. She left the college suddenly. Some scandal nobody cared to define. Her daughter studied here later. Another quiet beauty. Not much changes, you'll find. When she left me again, I sat with the houseman open in front of me, the candle guttering beside the margin's secret. Twice burned and still remembered. A phrase that wanted to confess, but not entirely. I wondered which of them had burned it first, Fawley, who regretted too late, or the woman who refused to be a footnote. On the table lay a library slip, half tucked beneath the book. The signature line bore a smudge. Fawley's initial, but the date column was overwritten. April, rewritten as September. A small correction, but corrections often betray conscience. As I left, the rain had begun again, rattling faintly against the diamond panes. I paused at the threshold, glancing back at the rows of books that seemed to breathe in the candlelight. Oxford has always known how to keep its ghosts shelved neatly between bindings. Outside, the quad was washed silver, the air thick with that particular stillness that makes one's own footsteps sound like intrusion. I thought of Fawley alone at his desk, of the ink still wet in the margin, of a woman who had rewritten a season to hide a sin. Lewis found me there, coat collar turned up, eyes fixed on nothing. He asked if I had found anything useful. I told him only that I had found a line of poetry, and that sometimes poetry tells us the truth only when it wishes to be left alone. I've never trusted a clergyman who owns too many adverbs. The Dean of St. Bride's kept them like surplus cassocks. He received me in rooms that smelled of beeswax and scripture, the rain clinging to the mullions as though it sought absolution. He began with the polished sorrow of colleges. Adrian was beloved, the community is bereft, our prayers are continuous. He left a small cough after the name as if it were ash. I told him I disliked euphemism. He smiled as one smiles at frost, making endurance pass for virtue. We must protect the college's reputation, he said, and there it was, the phrase I'd already met in another costume. The typewritten note in Fawley's room had spoken with the same patience. Formal, contrite, curiously impersonal. I watched the dean's lips shape every mild authority and heard the click of a penny falling. He offered tea. I asked for whiskey. He rang for neither, and the refusal disguised as forgetfulness told me more than an obituary could. A benefactor frowned above the mantel. Beside it, sermons that ended in brotherhood. The dean touched one with a finger accustomed to pointing. Adrian had struggled, he said. There were moral concerns, pastoral complications. We hoped for a quiet solution. A quiet solution is what the guilty call an alley without witnesses. I asked whether he had spoken to Helen Calthorpe. His gaze trespassed briefly toward the rain-streaked window. She is a gifted musician, he said, and then he misquoted Milton, polishing darkness visible into something blander. I corrected him gently. He looked as if someone had moved his prayer book. I asked about letters. He disliked the word. It implied proof. He preferred the administrative plural. Communications. Were any typed here? The secretaries assist me, he said. I merely sign, when necessary. But he had not signed the paragraph in Fawley's room. The absence of a signature has a grammar of its own, authority without ownership. Lewis, who had absorbed the room like blotting paper, asked whether censure had been discussed. The dean folded his hands into the shape of yes and mercy. He spoke of pastoral discretion, then offered the sentence that refuses to fade. We must do what is needful without spectacle. Needful without spectacle was the cadence of the suicide note. Style is a fingerprint for men who imagine they have none. He showed us the chapel from his window, stone wet as vellum, gutters shining like a reprimand. Our choir will sing for Adrian, he said. Mercy must be heard to be believed. I thought of Schubert and ash, of a woman writing in a margin with ink that would not dry. I asked whether Mrs. Parmenter had borrowed Houseman. He flinched so economically I almost admired it. My late wife preferred essays, he said, only then recalling he had not mentioned that she was late. We were dismissed with courtesy and incense that smells to me like conscience rehearsing. In the corridor, the floorboards voiced their confidences. At the notice board, a typed circular announced a disciplinary review from years ago. The punctuation, an M dash welded to its neighbors, matched the note by Forley's bed. Not proof, merely music to a pedant's ear, but I have followed smaller tunes. Down in the lodge, the porter handed me an envelope addressed to the dean in a feminine hand. "Found under Dr. Forley's mat, sir." I returned to the deanery and gave it over. He slit it with a letter opener shaped like a cross that had decided to be a dagger. He held the single sheet too long before reading. "Nothing of consequence," he said, and placed the paper in a drawer, turning the key. On the steps, Lewis asked what I made of him. "A man who prefers forgiveness to confession," I said. "And what does that leave us?" "A phrase and a rhythm," I told him, "and sometimes that is enough to begin, for the present." The rain thinned to a shy light. The chapel chimed a polite lie about the hour. I felt the ache, romance-wrestling cynicism to a drawer, and wrote 3 words that refused to behave: type, tone, trespass. The photograph arrived without ceremony, carried in an inter-office envelope that had learned discretion the hard way. The porter said it had slipped from beneath a blotter that still remembered the pressure of Forley's hand. I took it to the chapel vestry, where the light enters like careful advice and the floorboards try not to complain. A coach party in sepia, the St. Bride's Choir posed in Sunday brightness, 1979 scrawled across the back by a pen. Forley stands in the foreground, not yet thinned by illness. Beside him, a curate slim dean, collar straight as principal, hymn book gripped. But it was the girl behind them who altered the air. She has turned her head, declining the camera, as if refusing to let the future see her whole face. Lewis found me there, rain writing its own liturgy upon the vestry window. He said the sea in the background looked like grief pretending to be infinity, then called me fanciful. I told him he was right. Could the girl be our pianist? Not unless time had mislaid its feet. Likeness, I added, is a faith colleges cling to because it absolves them of chronology. We consulted the librarian. She examined the photograph as if it might confess a catalogue number. The trip, she remembered, had been poorly planned. Too much wind, insufficient sandwiches, a hymnal swept into the surf. She named a row of sensible coats and patient smiles, then paused on the girl. "That one," she said, sang as if secrets could stay in tune. "Married badly, quickly." Her mouth found the punctuation of discretion. A name. She considered and offered only a maiden initial, soft as secrecy. We found the relevant summer bound in brittle blue. The center pages printed a near-identical photograph. There the girl faced the camera. The resemblance to Helen was not likeness, but inevitability. Underneath sat the caption that turned key into lock: Miss L. Calthorpe, scholar. I carried the knowledge like a glass filled too close to the rim. When I asked Helen to walk with me along the cloister, she agreed in the way one agrees to a diagnosis. She looked at the photograph and did not touch it. "My mother," she said, as if the words had borrowed her breath. She studied here when summers were longer than their shadows. She sang for Adrian, and then she sang for no one. The dean's pastoral care, she added, was furnished with adjectives too many. What had been burned, and by whom? Letters then, copies lately. Whose copies? Possession, she said, is not a reliable guide to authorship. Her sentences were tidy, almost too educated to grieve at all. I noticed soot like a crescent moon upon her cuff, and the ghost of lavender trying to correct the damp. Back in my rooms, I laid the photograph beside the crossword. The clue was unambitious, proof of kinship discovered in coastal illumination. I wrote lighthouse, crossed it for beacon, and found neither willing to oblige. The smaller word waited within the clue itself, a guilty syllable in plain sight. Lineage, I wrote, and let the pencil rest. That evening, the dean sent a message by his secretary, requesting restraint. The college, he said, was in mourning and preferred the past to remain liturgically dim. I poured whiskey and studied the girl whose profile could not stop telling the truth. The sea behind her attempted to erase the shoreline. Seas fail, photographs do not forgive. I slept poorly and woke convinced the picture had moved on the desk. It had not. Only my sympathies had shifted, which is worse. Somewhere between ink and ash, a family had tried to revise itself without acknowledging the first edition. Somewhere a sentence had been burned twice, and yet its grammar still shaped the air. Some truths arrive quietly, knocking once, and when ignored, they sit in the dark, patient as dust on vellum forever. It was Lewis who found it, though neither of us understood its shape until much later. He came into my office with the manner of a man bringing bad weather indoors, careful, apologetic, half convinced it would pass if left unacknowledged. He placed the envelope on my desk as one might set down a confession not one's own. "Recovered from the ashes," he said. "Forley's fireplace. Torn." The handwriting was the same as the note Helen had admitted to burning, only this time the flame had hesitated, leaving behind the ghost of its obedience. I took the fragments gently, like relics of a saint no one quite believed in. The paper was cream, the edges blackened, the ink half melted. A few words survived, reluctant but legible. "She knows. She remembers what you did." Beneath it, a half-line of something unfinished. No forgiveness. And then nothing but a wound of soot. The room seemed smaller. Even the rain at the window lost its rhythm. There was a faint scent of singed sweetness, the residue of paper too personal to burn clean. I imagined Forley kneeling before the hearth, watching the flames decide which sentences to spare. Lewis asked if it was Helen's writing. "Possibly," I said. But then again, resemblance is the one evidence that lies most gracefully. He frowned, waiting for translation. I told him that grief imitates handwriting. It wants to resemble the hand that hurt it. We took the fragments to the college typist, an elderly woman who knew more about the private failings of dons than the dons themselves did. She confirmed what I already suspected. The spacing was identical to the suicide note. Both had been typed, not written, both on the same machine. And that machine, as she quietly revealed, belonged to the dean's office. It was one of those moments when deduction feels less like discovery and more like trespass. The dean had claimed to know nothing of correspondence, nothing of letters. Yet here they were, his tools, his spacing, his discreet machinery of forgiveness. I walked back through the quad. The rain had thinned to a sort of disciplined drizzle. St. Bride's wore its usual disguise of respectability, all clean stone and mild regret. The chapel bell rehearsed the hour with unnecessary devotion. I found myself at the deanery door without meaning to arrive. He received me with the gentleness of a man certain of his own virtue. His study smelled of old sermons and lemon polish. I told him the letter had surfaced, or rather, what remained of it. His eyelids flickered, not from surprise, but from calculation. He asked whether it was legible. "Enough," I said. He spoke then of Forley's melancholy, his guilt, his spiritual exhaustion. He spoke of compassion as though it were a sacrament only he had been ordained to administer. I asked if he had typed any letters on the college machine recently. He hesitated, then smiled, the weary smile of a man accustomed to being found out and forgiven in the same breath. "Administrative matters," he said. Lewis would have interrupted, but I raised a hand. The dean was quoting from his own sermon now, some passage about the burden of mercy. The rhythm was familiar. I heard it not in the voice of a preacher, but in the cadence of that typewritten suicide note. The same syntax of resignation, the same commas placed with moral precision. Before leaving, I glanced at the papers on his desk, all perfectly aligned, as though obedience itself had been trained to stand to attention. There was a torn carbon sheet near the typewriter, a faint indentation visible under the lamplight. I traced it with a finger. Please see that she understands. Outside, the air tasted of rain and guilt. I walked without destination, letting the stones direct my thoughts. Helen's letter, Forley's death, the Dean's silence. They formed a pattern as incomplete as the crossword I'd left unfinished that morning. The clue had been simple. Instrument of redemption, 6 letters. I'd written organ and then crossed it out. I stopped at the chapel, the door half open, the smell of damp hymnals spilling into the night. Inside, a single candle trembled before the altar, its flame refusing the dignity of stillness. I stood there a while, watching it struggle. Forgiveness, I thought, is only fire with better manners. It is one of Oxford's older amusements to mistake decorum for truth. By the 8th day, I had collected plausibilities the way the chapel collects drafts. Helen planned it, I told myself. She burned, she played, she wept in a tense that refused the present. The ashes spoke her name in crescent smudges. The porter remembered the cream envelope. The houseman Margin carried a hand as slender as hers. I set the pieces out like chessmen and admired their symmetry until I noticed I had forgotten the opening. Elegies make excellent gambits. They rarely win the endgame. I asked to see her rooms, not as an officer, but as a man who dislikes unfinished music. She let me in with the courtesy of someone visited too late. The place obeyed itself. Books squared, kettle empty, a window trained on bricks that declined to be a view. "You may look," she said, and I did. On the piano lay a thin notebook tied with a ribbon that had learned obedience. Inside, staccato entries, rehearsals counted like penances. A line about ash under fingernails, another about a man who speaks forgiveness better than he practices it. "Who is he?" I asked, though the pronoun had already buttoned its collar. "A man the college listens to," she said, and left it ethically vague. I closed the notebook and said nothing about the smell of spent matches hiding beneath the lavender. By the sink, 3 used stems lay in a neat row. One black, one red, one undecided. Indecision leaves its own soot. She did not ask for the photograph back. She knew I would bring it when it learned to speak. In the afternoon, the dean preached, as deans must when weather requires absolution. The chapel smelled of wet wool and provisional humility. He hymned fire as purgation and mercy as solvent. Milton was persuaded to support both propositions. His adverbs multiplied like choir boys, earnestly, charitably, properly. It was the cadence of the suicide note in liturgical dress. Faces stiffened into virtue. Afterward, he found me at the west door with consolation wrapped as policy. "Carbons," I asked. "Do you keep them?" "Administrative habit," he replied, the smile of a man closing a drawer. I thought of the torn sheet beside his typewriter, the indentation under lamplight, the way guilt prefers faint imprints to signatures. Back at the station, Lewis had been busier than my suspicion. He unloaded a porter's rescue of paper from Forley's rooms, a register from the high 70s, a list of addresses, a postcard of a northern pier dissolving into fog. On its reverse, a tidy feminine hand. "Do not bring your music. Bring your courage." No signature. No date. The postmark had surrendered itself to rain. Held to the lamp, the card confessed a pressure mark beneath the final full stop, as if the writer had nearly signed and remembered how the past punishes names. "Where does that leave us?" said Lewis. "With a woman who refuses to sign and a man who signs for everyone," I said. He produced a timetable from the secretary, too helpful for prudence. The night of Forley's death, the dean had been in his rooms. Earlier, he had inspected the library to approve repairs. The librarian recalled only that he admired Houseman with a reverence 30 years too late. I poured tea into mugs that resented the substitution and returned to the crossword waiting on my desk. Correction that conceals 9 letters. I wrote erasure and counted 8. I wrote palimpsest and felt the soft click of a door I had not known was locked. A life written over, the old words faintly legible beneath the new. For a while the red herrings gleamed as if scale were substance, Helen as vengeful daughter, Forley as martyr to belated guilt, the dean as custodian doing harm in a grammar called good. Each theory arrived with its own cigarette and perfumed the air with plausibility. Yet the porter's small phrase refused to join the choir. Cream paper, sir, not college stock. That stubborn fibre sat in the throat of my narrative, resisting the smooth swallow of certainty. I took a slow walk round St. Bride's at dusk. The rain had demoted itself to mist. In the lodge, a pile of circulars bore the dean's tidy rubric. The im-dash, welded to its neighbours, matched the suicide note's punctuation as neatly as a choir boy matches pitch. Style is a fingerprint, good men believe they do not leave. Near the chapel door, a student sang scales to no one. Her voice rose and fell like a hand, lifting and letting go, lifting and letting go. Back in my rooms, I spread the postcard, the margin, the timetable, the torn carbons. Theories behaved beautifully when kept apart. Together they argued like dons after wine. I remembered the whisper I had overheard at the first concert. He left a note, she burned it twice, and understood, briefly and perhaps incorrectly, that the note might not be the one at the bedside. He left a note could mean the poem, the margin, the correction written over a life and then over again. Burned twice. Once in the hearth, once in the sermon. Night arrived with its usual unshowy authority. A single light burned in the deanery like a promise oversold. In my pocket, the postcard's unwritten postscript pressed its absence into my thumb. I have learned to distrust solutions that flatter intelligence. They are mirrors that shave too close. The facts had introduced themselves politely. The truth had not yet accepted the invitation. Somewhere a sentence waited to be read in its original hand. I poured whiskey, left the crossword open at palimpsest, and listened to the rain writing the city back into itself. The crossword had been waiting for me all along, folded neatly beside the typewritten note I'd kept in my drawer longer than was wise. I don't know why I turned to it that evening. Habit, perhaps, or the quiet superstition that puzzles behave like people. Given enough neglect, they grow forgiving. It was the Times, from 3 days before Forley's death. Most clues were filled, his careful handwriting precise, but, unhurried, the last few squares left empty as though he'd grown tired of certainties. One clue arrested me. Burn twice, and truth returns. 7. He'd written Phoenix, hesitated, then struck it through. Once, lightly, then again, more firmly. I stared at the second line, the darker one. Twice burned. The words replayed themselves with an uninvited precision. Lewis came in as I was turning the page. He brought the day's rain with him. It hung on his coat like something he'd rather not keep. The report from the chemists had arrived. Barbiturates, whiskey, nothing exotic. I told him we'd already known that, just not what to do with it. He said Helen Calthorpe had come to the lodge earlier, asking whether she might collect something of Forley's. His music scores, perhaps, or a letter he'd promised to return. The porter had turned her away. She'd gone without argument, but with that particular calm that suggests fury, postponed. I thought again of the crossword, of Forley's crossings out, his tiny gestures of self-erasure. The clue was not about rebirth, I decided, but about confession. Burn twice, and truth returns. Not because it survives the flame, but because the act of burning acknowledges it was once alive. The dean, meanwhile, had made himself conspicuously available. His sermon drafts now circulated like moral leaflets. I reread one that Lewis had borrowed from the chapel lectern. The handwriting was his, the rhythm unmistakable. Forgiveness is the art of remembering selectively. I underlined it once, as Fawley might have done, and poured another measure of whiskey I hadn't earned. There is a moment in every investigation, or perhaps in every life, when knowledge ceases to feel like progress. The pattern was too perfect now. The dean's sermons, the typewriter, the burned letter, Helen's silence. I'd arranged them so neatly that the truth had no room to breathe. Still, one detail refused to sit still. In the photograph of the 1979 choir, which I had kept beside the crossword, Fawley stood in front of a boy holding the hymn book upside down. At the time, I dismissed it as trivial, the sort of mischief Oxford hides under its Latin. But the boy's surname on the roll of members was Parmenter, the dean's nephew, not yet in orders, already shadowing sanctity. It was nearly midnight when I walked back to St. Bride's. The rain had thinned to a patient drizzle. The college looked as it always does before a scandal, guilty of nothing, but aware that guilt improves the architecture. The porter nodded. He'd been reading something folded small in his palm, a letter by the look of it. I asked whose. He hesitated, then said, hers. She'd come again. Left it for the dean. I took the path along the cloister, each puddle catching the lamplight like the eye of an animal that knows the hunt is over. From the deanery window came the slow tap of typewriter keys, the measured rhythm of righteousness, composing itself. I watched for a moment, remembering how easily guilt borrows the language of virtue. Back in my flat, I reopened the crossword. Only one clue remained unanswered, a confession twice disguised. 6. I wrote secret, then paused. It fit, but only just. A confession disguised is not quite a secret. It is a performance of honesty, a lie rehearsed for God's approval. I replaced the word with phoenix again and left it uncrossed. Outside, the rain resumed. The same rain that had witnessed every conversation, every misstep, every promise of forgiveness too late to matter. Oxford would sleep, and the dean would rise to preach redemption to a choir that no longer believed in tune. I stared at the crossword until the squares blurred, and for the first time that week, I thought perhaps Fawley had solved more than I ever would. The dean sent for me after evensong, though the verb carried more silk than force. His message promised a conversation for the good of the college, which is how Oxford asks to keep its conscience indoors. I walked to the deanery beneath a sky the color of old pewter. The rain had found new patience and tapped the stones like a tutor correcting manners. He received me beside a fire, generous without heat. He began with gratitude, the first refuge of men who have misplaced their honesty. You have spared us spectacle, he said, and I said I had spared nothing yet. He asked if I believed Adrian's death a matter of despair. I told him despair prefers untidiness. Fawley had died like a man arranging chairs. I showed him the fragment from the hearth, the half-sentence that chose ash over ink. He barely glanced once. Anonymous vindictiveness, he murmured. Grief loves disguises. I set the piece upon his sermon draft. The spacing aligned like guilt recognizing itself in a mirror. You use the machine, I said. Administrative necessity, he replied, every syllable polished. For what? I asked. Correspondence, he said, which is how letters travel when they wish to renounce their authors. He moved to the decanter and poured me whiskey with the courtesy of a confessor. Forgiveness, he observed, is the bravest version of forgetting. I told him forgetting is a talent the guilty lend to God and charge interest. He spoke of the 70s as if war had been fought there. A choir trip, a love too quick for liturgy, a young woman who learned that secrecy is a hymn with no amen. I asked, whose love? He said only that pastoral duties sometimes refuse to end. He admired Houseman, I said. He allowed the compliment to injure him. We talked about Helen as men talk when they are not certain whether they are protecting a woman or themselves. He called her brave. I said bravery is a verb, not a prize. He said she should be spared. I asked from what. He stared into the careful fire. Adrian wanted to confess and could not, he said. He came to me sick with a generosity that would have harmed the living. I advised a gentler exit. Did you drug him? He looked at the flames and told me sin rarely travels alone. There are, he said, deaths that charity accelerates. He had given Fawley a draft, less than a mercy and more than advice. The note was mine. I hoped the style might look like his. We must do what is needful without spectacle. The sentence arrived weary from rehearsal. For a long moment, the room studied us. I thought of Helen's margin, of the photographs turned profile, of the postcard that nearly signed its name. I said that the law would hear only the simplest music a choir can manage. He nodded, almost grateful. Simplification is how institutions pray. I asked whether Helen knew the truth of her parentage. He closed his eyes, like a man tasting a childhood flavor. She suspects what would injure her most, he said. I considered the shape of that. The past had been copied and recopied until the carbon outlived the original. On his desk lay a clean sheet of paper waiting for instruction. I pushed the torn fragment across to meet it. Fire, I said, is a poor archivist. He smiled with a relief. It is, he said, but it teaches us which words insist on staying. I left him with his tidy blaze and walked the cloister where puddles repeated the chapel lamps. The rain had softened into something like practice. Lewis asked, when I found him at the gate, whether we had our confession. We have a style, I said, and a kindness sharpened into harm. That night, back in my flat, I poured whiskey and opened the crossword again. Instrument of redemption, 6 letters, still waiting. I wrote organ once more, then, after a pause, eraser. The second looked wrong until I understood how often we worship corrections. I slept eventually and dreamed of a margin that refused to dry. The choir sang for him because colleges prefer music to explanation. I stood at the back of the chapel where stone keeps its counsel and drafts make promises they cannot keep. Helen sat at the piano with the composure I recognize from hospitals, the stillness people borrow to keep their hands from shaking. The dean read a prayer about time's mercies. His voice behaved, and the congregation did the rest. Lewis kept his hat in his hands, though hats are discouraged in devotion. He whispered that the dean looked smaller. I said some men shrink when they give away what was never theirs. He asked whether we were finished. I suggested regret has an encore and would perform it shortly. During the slow movement, I noticed Helen's left hand lagging by a heartbeat. Not incompetence, intention. She withheld a phrase, the musical equivalent of redacting a name. Consent disguised as restraint. When the cadence arrived, it landed short of consolation, like a letter that knows the right address and chooses the wrong door. Afterward, she walked alone into the cloister, and I followed at a distance that announced care without intimacy. You have what you came for, she said without turning. I told her I had what was left. She asked whether the law would be generous. Law is never generous, I said. Only people are, and they are unreliable. Under the arch, the rain stitched the air with invisible thread. She said the dean had written to her, a note folded into the program like a blessing. Do not play the last page. Let the college be spared. I asked whether she obeyed. Obedience, she said, is only a rehearsal for anger. Then she looked at me as if I might absolve them both. I said absolution is an instrument I never learned. In hall, the sherry smelled of apology. Dons spoke softly with their backs to one another, the oldest form of discretion. The dean thanked me for my understanding. He used the phrase pastoral necessity with the tenderness of a man stroking a weapon he has polished too often. I asked whether Helen's mother had been offered the same necessity. He said the past is not ours to repair. I told him the past dislikes volunteers. In Fawley's rooms, the flowers had learnt decorum. On the desk lay his marked Houseman, returned from the library like a sinner who suspects the wrong church. I held the flyleaf to the lamp. The inscription appeared faintly doubled, not by ink but by pressure, the ghost of someone tracing for practice. Twice burned and still remembered. Beneath the page lay a thin sheet that receives carbon. It bore no words, only indentations, a date, then a line break, then the outline of a single initial. An initial carries its own verdict because it is always, almost, a name. I slid the carbon leaf back, knowing it would keep its silence for a while longer. Lewis arrived with the chemist's confirmation. The draught had been bittered, something added to disguise taste. Clerical charity does not include pharmacology, I said. He asked what we would do now. We will assemble the choir and listen for the voice that insists too loudly on harmony. Evening brought a thin light that colleges use to rewrap their scandals. I walked the quadrangle alone. At the lodge, the porter slipped me a program from the service. On the back, a neat hand had penciled a crossword diagram, 6 boxes, the 2nd and 5th shaded, and beneath a clue, undo without erasing. Undo without record is fallacy. The answer wanted remembrance. I wrote retrace and felt the click of an old door. I looked up at the deanery window and knew some steps would be walked again, this time audibly. I found Helen by the river, where Oxford pretends to be older than water. A rowing 8 rehearsed sincerity in the rain. She said she had almost told him, then decided memory deserves privacy. I asked if she meant her father or her grief. She said they were the same man. The boat drew a line, and the line heeled behind it. Later, at home, I poured whiskey that did not ask questions. I held the program to the lamplight and read the penciled clue again. Undo without erasing. I thought of Fawley's crossings out, the dean's tidy carbons, my own tolerances dressed as fairness. Some regrets are music, others are merely noise that has learned grammar. I left the window open to the night's small weather and listened to Oxford scrape its chair back from the table, as if preparing to apologize for still being here. I've learned that endings arrive with the politeness of letters no one truly wishes to open. That morning, Oxford lay under a light fog that seemed reluctant to lift, the kind that makes the city appear to be erasing itself in slow degrees. I walked to my desk with the half-conscious dread of a man expecting nothing new, only the echo of old things rearranged. On the desk, an envelope waited. No postmark, no handwriting. Inside, a single page folded twice, once neatly, once hastily. The words were typed, precise, unadorned. Some ashes are better left. I knew the hand, though not the heart behind it. Helen's restraint was as articulate as confession. The dean had been found earlier that morning, collapsed in his study. The nurse said his heart had failed him. I believed her. Hearts often fail when they are most overworked by forgiveness. The note he left behind, if it can be called that, was almost pastoral. He wrote of mercy and fatigue, of how silence sometimes serves God better than truth. I suppose he was right. Truth, like music, can be unbearable if played to completion. Lewis came later, shaking rain from his coat as though it were gilt. He told me the college intended to bury Fawley and the dean within days of one another, a symmetry that would have pleased them both, for different reasons. He asked if Helen would attend. I said she would, though not in the way they expected. She would play, I thought, not mourn. Some people confess best through the precision of sound. He lingered at the window, watching the drizzle run down the glass. "Funny business," he said. "Two men gone and the lady still walking free. I told him freedom is never the same as peace. He said he didn't follow. I said that was precisely the problem. When he left, I sat a long while with the silence. It was not the silence of absence, but of equilibrium, as though the world had agreed to stop arguing for one brief hour. On my table lay the crossword from the previous week. I had never finished it. One clue remained: what rises after being destroyed? 7. I wrote Phoenix again, without crossing it out this time. Then, perhaps out of superstition, I burned the paper in my ashtray. Once. Then again. The second burning seemed necessary, though I could not have explained why. Later that evening, I walked through St. Bride's. The porter nodded with the solemnity reserved for those who have already forgotten whom they are mourning. In the chapel, the candles trembled with a fatigue that felt human. Helen sat alone at the piano. No music before her, no gesture toward performance. Just the steady posture of someone who has decided at last to stop pretending. I did not approach. Some distances must be preserved, even when they ache to be crossed. When she began to play, it was the same Schubert piece, the one that had introduced us all to the notion of endings disguised as melodies. Only now it was slower, drained of polish, the pauses longer than the notes deserved. Halfway through, she stopped, hands hovering above the keys as if waiting for absolution. Then she began again, the same passage, softer, lower, almost inaudible. Twice played, twice burned. I understood. Outside, the rain had hardened into a steady fall. The bell of St. Giles marked the hour indifferently. I lit a cigarette, though I didn't need one, and watched the smoke write its brief theology against the air. Some cases close themselves by exhaustion rather than justice. I've told myself I prefer it that way, that peace, however compromised, is kinder than truth pursued to its ruin. Yet sometimes in quiet rooms, I hear the faint echo of a piano where no instrument stands, and the scent of burnt paper lingers without reason. There are crimes of passion, and there are crimes of mercy. The distinction, I think, lies only in the handwriting of the final note, and in whether one dares to read it twice.